Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Reuben Brigety. I'm Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. We are delighted to welcome you to this evening discussing why ethics matter in the study of international affairs. Let me introduce our panel before we could talk a little bit about how we're going to conduct tonight. So to my immediate left is Professor Chris Kojm, Professor of Practice at the Elliott School of International Affairs, former Chairman of the National Intelligence Council. Professor Janne Nolan, research professor at the School of International Affairs, Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and we are in his house. Dr. Joel Rosenthal, the president of the Carnegie Council of Ethics and International Affairs. So I often say to our students that international affairs students are a special breed of student because by definition they care about the state of the world and want to prepare themselves to go off and face the world's toughest challenges. As a result of that, the other thing I say to our students is that if you want to go and engage the world's toughest challenges, I guarantee you will find yourself confronted with challenging ethical dilemmas. And as a means of trying to ensure that we are giving our students the very best preparation to be effective foreign policy professionals, at the Elliott School, we've started an initiative to ensure that ethics and ethics education is a central part of everything that we do. So we have a paradigm at the Elliott School called STEP, which stands for Achieving Elite Excellence in Scholarship, Teaching, Ethics, and Practice. And as a means of emphasizing the ethical component, we have also launched something we call the LEAP Initiative, or the Leadership Ethics and Practice Initiative. So what we hope to do tonight is talk a little bit about why ethics matter and how do you go about ensuring that it is a core component of not only international affairs education, but frankly, international affairs practice as one goes off into the field. And make sure that we do so with a relatively brief conversation with our colleagues here at the table, but also to make sure it is interactive as possible with our colleagues here in the audience. I will observe one rule that I practice religiously at the Elliott School when I'm giving lectures, and that is ensuring that we have gender equity in questions. So we will go ladies, gentlemen, back and forth. So please prepare yourselves accordingly. Chris, why don't we start with you? So you have a decades-long career in the intelligence community of the United States, working through some very difficult challenges. And then coming out of that, coming to the Elliott School as a professor, and now taking on this issue of leading the development of our ethics curriculum. I wonder how, in your mind, you marry what you have seen over the course of your career with how we ought to be thinking about teaching ethics to our students.
Well, thank you. Well, it's a great question, and I think the first point I would make is the criticality of focusing on it in school, at the graduate level, and also the undergraduate level, because young people are learning a lot of things about issues they care about deeply, and you go to the workplace and you may end up doing something completely different than what you studied, and there will be many surprises in terms of the content of what you do. But in terms of the skills you learn and start to develop in school and follow on, they will be with you all your life. And so that's why I embraced from the outset the emphasis of the dean here on leadership, ethics, and practice. Just a brief word about the L and the P. Business schools, military academies, they teach leadership all the time. International affairs schools need to do the same. The practical skills you learn in terms of interpersonal skills, writing, briefing, teamwork, they will be with you for the next 40 years after you graduate school. And that course on China may fade. So to ethics, to the heart of the question here. You're going to face ethics issues from the first week you're on the job. And so we've got to get students thinking about how to think about those issues. And I'm not very big on prescribing solutions that here's the ethics handbook and here are the answers, but just to think critically about ethical issues. And let me just give one example from the intelligence community in my time in government. The hardest thing in the world of intelligence is telling really powerful people something they don't want to hear. My boss in the Congress, Lee Hamilton, who was chairman of the Intelligence Committee, framed it this way: presidents usually get the intelligence they want. And so the real struggle is to speak truthfully about the facts as best you know them, and that's really, really hard to do at senior levels. And case in point, I won't belabor it, but the Iraq War decision. I was in government at the time. It was clear that President Bush and his administration wanted to go to war in Iraq. It was clear that the most important argument was that Iraq was developing a nuclear capability. And the facts didn't lend themselves to make that case, as we learned later. But the argument at the time, and forgive my brief discussion of technicalities, concerned aluminum tubes. And were they for centrifuges and making nuclear stuff, or were they for artillery? Well, the experts in Britain and the experts in the Energy Department said, you can't use these for centrifuges, they'll blow up. Everyone else in the community said, well, Mr. President, we're sure that the Iraqis are developing them for nuclear weapons. I was at the Department of State at the time, in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And the Bureau resisted that judgment and said, these aren't for nuclear applications. But the Bureau lost the debate, and that point of difference was relegated to a footnote. What do you know about footnotes? Nobody reads footnotes. And they did not appear in the executive summary. And so this important point of dissent was lost. And so just to finish, moving forward to the time when I became chairman of the National Intelligence Council, I said we will never have footnotes again relating to substance. Yes, cite your sources correctly. But points of substantive difference must appear in the document, and when they're important, they must appear in the executive summary. They must be briefed to policymakers. Because the long and the short of it is, the intelligence community only gets hard questions. All those questions have incomplete information because people are trying to hide information from you, governments or others. And so, smart people will take limited data and give different interpretations. It's really important that policymakers know about dissent. And Jan and others on the panel, and me too, we're going to talk about how hard it is when you're way down the food chain to give that dissenting view and not get your head cut off and not lose your job. Hard to do, but that's the challenge. I'll stop.
So a footnote to the footnote. I don't know if any of you have ever seen these things called challenge coins. You know, they're started by the military, but now everybody has them. Apparently President Trump has them as well with Kim Jong-un. You know, when you sort of go to a meeting, someone gives you a challenge coin. Well, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department has a challenge coin, and it says INR, and there's a footnote at the bottom, which is their sort of passive-aggressive way to say they got it right when everybody else got it wrong. So, Jan, you are famed for many things, but one of them is for using scholarship based on real-world case studies to demonstrate to students and to others in the consuming public how ethics actually work and why they matter in practice. So let me ask you, but we also were chatting a little bit before about how many of our students are astounded when we talk about case studies from the dark ages of the late 1990s, and are always sort of asking for more time-sensitive, real-world case studies. So let me ask you about one that we've sort of grappled with this country recently, and that is the confirmation of CIA, now confirmed CIA Director Gina Haspel. I actually can't think of a more recent example where there has been played out in the public sphere such a profound debate on, frankly, the ethics of action in international affairs. On the one hand, those who say that Director Haspel's involvement in CIA, black sites where torture is alleged to have happened, were by definition disqualifying for her to be director of the CIA. Others saying that she was following legal instruction as a framework defined at the time, and by the way, she was not alone. So how do you sort of think about and parse that through, and how can that example be relevant for current students of ethics in international affairs?
So clearly it's hugely relevant to the discussion of what you do in a situation that, as Chris has alluded to, when the prevailing consensus at the highest levels and wherever you are working goes against judgments that you are able to make based on training, information, access to intelligence. And you are faced with the dilemma of whether you continue to support the policy or exercise a judgment and find some way to have a voice. In this particular instance and other instances, we were extremely critical of intelligence and policymakers who did not, quote, speak truth to power. So this has become the latest kind of injunction to younger people to, you need to speak truth to power. I think Chris and I have both struggled with the issue of how do you teach people to be prepared to speak truth to power when in situations like this where there are fundamental issues of morality, of actually strategic imperative, of self-interest. But how do you teach people how to speak truth to power without getting shot in the face? And I say that not lightly because there's two sides of this. On the one hand, there are people who have spoken truth to power and have ended up completely marginalized and are not remembered historically. There's some who have survived in various ways. Or there's the alternative of going along with the prevailing viewpoint. I think you're right that this case, in her case, encapsulated all of the tensions that were going on post 9/11. The fact that there was no resistance to the idea of torture, or so little resistance inside the decision-making and inside the actual operations, that there was such a sense of imperative to do something that would redound so badly to the United States, quite apart from the victims, but to the entire reputation of the United States. And there you have, it's not about her, is it? It is certainly about her in the sense of the confirmation process, but the reason I find this topic so fascinating for everybody in this room and everyone who comes to an international affairs school goes back to what Chris said. We try to train military officers, as you know, to be loyal to the Constitution, to disobey illegal orders. There is at least some familiarity with the fact that there will be predicaments. There's no tradition of teaching civilians that they are going to be up against these kinds of things. And we'll come back to this, I'm sure, but one example I'll use that I try to teach, I got to know Robert McNamara very well, for those of you, anybody who does not know. Robert McNamara was racked by guilt for his role in the Vietnam War, for the fact that he knew that the strategy was failing, but he continued to work as Secretary of Defense and send people into combat and to die for a strategy that he knew was completely mismatched to the facts on the ground. This is not an isolated incident. He was just a celebrated person. He never recovered from. So when people say ethics is kind of nice, it's sort of a cosmetic, It's actually demonstrably true that your conscience is a living, breathing organism that you cannot mess with too many times before you become a broken person. That's the psychological aspect. And I, through the research that we did over a long time, looking at different cases, some from most from the 20th century, like Iran, the failure to speak up has been the source of strategic failure over and over again for the United States. So we cannot train leaders unless we teach them about this.
Thank you. Joel, as president of the Carnegie Council of Ethics and International Affairs, I mean, obviously you have a critical role in this debate in American public life, I would argue. And let me also take this moment to express our gratitude on part of the Elliott School for the partnership that we're continuing to build in the space. I wonder, from your perspective, how does one take these sorts of concepts, which may seem esoteric, may seem marginal, and inject them into a broader public discourse, not only for students, but sort of broadly for the public?
That's great. First of all, thank you. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for what you're doing in the school. I do think that one way to get to a better public dialogue and better public understanding is to actually teach these issues at the graduate level, at the undergraduate level, and at the level of civics in public education, all the way through our system. So I think what you're doing is essential. I don't have any sort of magic answer to this, but I think that the best way to teach leadership, ethics, and practice is actually to show it, much as you're doing now, to raise it up, to shine the light on it, to heaven help us analyze it in some way, and to have a civilized discourse around it. That maybe the bar may be too low, but I think if we can, in some ways, depoliticize it and just say this is an ethical issue. It's about who we want to be as individuals. I think ethics a lot is about just self-discovery. Who am I? What are my values? What are my standards? What do I expect of myself? And then also, of course, the institution that I'm in. To have some personal reflection and some public reflection on norms. I see that this has become a more public word now. I think it's a good thing. What is the word norm? A norm is expected and required behavior. What do you expect and require from yourself? What is expected and required from the institution in which I serve? Think about it. Those things change over time. Right? Norms are not static. They change a lot. And think about in your own lifetime, the institutions that you're in, the norms change. Right? So that's a very powerful thing. I thought I would also just kind of just interject a couple of things that I've found very helpful in kind of framing the discussion. Some of them having to do with a couple of presentations that were given here at Carnegie Council that were informed by scholarship, but were public-facing. And one was just a few weeks ago, John Lewis Gaddis was here talking about his book on grand strategy. And he begins the book by actually citing a scene in the movie Lincoln, the Spielberg movie about Lincoln. And Thaddeus Stevens asks Lincoln, how can you use these means, these sort of smoke-filled rooms and bribes and payoffs and deception and all this to try to get through the 13th Amendment, which was a noble goal. And Lincoln says, he uses the image of the compass, and he says, I know my true north. My true north is to preserve the Union and to emancipate the slaves. That's my true north. I know where I want to go. But if I follow true north, I'm going to hit a swamp and a river and a mountain. I can't go straight ahead, right? I need to have situational inertia. I need to move, right? And I think that's a way to think about. So in order to think about ethics, think what is your true north, and what is the true north of the policy that you're trying to get to, and what are the sort of compromises you'll be willing to make. I remember as an undergraduate, there was a famous lecture given by Frank Friedel, who was a biographer of Franklin Roosevelt. He made a similar point about Roosevelt. Roosevelt liked to use a nautical analogy, right? If you're trying to sail upwind, your goal is here, the wind is coming in that direction. How do you get there? You have to tack back and forth. You cannot go straight into the wind. So leadership is goal-driven, but it is compromise-ridden. You will face compromises. There's no magic formula other than to reflect on what your goals and standards are.
But if I can, but right, but that is the essence of the challenge, right?
Right.
Because to keep going back to the navigational metaphors, I mean, how far can you go off course, or how far can you tack port or starboard before you're fundamentally off course?
So I don't have,
even if you do know what your true north
right.
is.
So I'm going to give you one other point of reference. I have others later if you want to share readings, but Avishai Margalit has written a book on this called On Compromise and Rotten Compromises. And he tries to answer without a degree of precision, but I think it gets close to what you're asking. What are the compromises that you're willing to make, and what are the compromises that you're not willing to make? And he does have sort of a recipe. I'm not going to sort of give it here, but we do have some guidance on these things to sort of think through what's acceptable. But I do think at the end of the day, some of it is who do I want to be? What is my role in this? And at the end of the day, maybe I won't be remembered.
So, right, and can I just say, sometimes the compromise is tactics and strategy and knowledge of how to be more persuasive. It has never been, this is, again, one of the problems that if you don't at least warn people that they're going to get into situations where they should be prepared for pressures, they're not going to be very effective, even if they do dissent. Often, sometimes there's really, it may be very noble, but it doesn't achieve much. The difficult case of, I was on the investigation of the 1998 bombings, of the first Al-Qaeda bombings, simultaneous bombings of 2 American embassies, and I was on that investigation, and I met the ambassador in Nairobi, who had been issuing warning for quite a long time about the security. She ended up, and I'm not suggesting she could have done something differently. She did everything she could. She ended up not only with the tremendous guilt of having failed to save the lives of the people who were killed when the terrorism came, but her career was damaged. We have many, many cases of this, where the speaking truth to power business, what you're doing, you're not even engaging in dissent. You're presenting intelligence or information that just doesn't comport with an impenetrable consensus of the time. So we have to teach people about the complexities of that.
And to take an example that is not from international affairs, but it's one that's been in the news lately for me, is the issue of what happened at Michigan State University with now disgraced Dr. Larry Nassar has been convicted of abusing hundreds of young girls. And obviously the allegation against the university is that multiple people knew something at some point, but no one did anything early enough, which it has now cost the university $500 million, at least, in terms of settlements. And one has to ask the question, on the one hand, there is clearly, whether it's dealing with American lives at an embassy or dealing with the financial implications to a university, there is clearly a hard case rationale for standing up and doing the right thing, either positively or negatively. And then one has to ask the question, so what do you do when you're with an institution that doesn't want to hear it? I mean, you must have seen examples of this, Chris.
Oh, sure. If you want to stay on the theme of Michigan State here, on Capitol Hill, when I worked there, things would happen. And the rule that was learned by me, and I learned it on time, but others learned it too late, I'm afraid, is that when you get a report like that, your obligation is to act. It's not that you know what the solution is, but it's to get this allegation into the proper channels just as soon as you can. it's not up to you to do the investigation, but to ensure that professionals who have that responsibility are seized with that matter at the moment you learn it.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone talks about how you change organizations by changing incentive structures. Incentive structures also are reward structures and punitive structures. So if you know the failure to report sexual abuse for most of my adult life and efforts to do so and finding that you have nothing but resistance has created this problem that successive generations have lived with this. And now the tides have turned, the incentive structures has changed. It will be very interesting to see if this persists. But I really like what you just said. You don't sit on this information and say, well, I think you're probably exaggerating. There's really, this is the analogy, and there's no terrorism in East Africa. Terrorism is in the Middle East. What do you mean there's Al-Qaeda cells in Nairobi? You're supposed to report that up the chain and do some analysis, and there should be procedures for these kinds of things. To have the marketplace of ideas that is supposed to ensure better policy.
Joel, maybe I could ask you one other question, and meanwhile, everybody else start getting ready. Ladies, you're first. So start getting your questions ready. One of the I once heard going into as U.S. forces were sitting in Kuwait preparing to go into Iraq, they had an awful lot of time on their hands. And I heard one infantry battalion commander set up sort of a mock village so his soldiers could practice kind of shoot, no shoot drills. And he said he was doing this so that his troops could know what doing the right thing feels like, particularly when rules are ambiguous. Or when there are a series of countervailing pressures to the contrary. So from your long study and from your engagement spending on this, what can you tell aspiring students, aspiring policymakers about how to inform their moral compass so they, A, know what doing the right thing feels like, and B, have the strength to be able to execute it?
Oh, that's great. Well, this goes back to Aristotle, it goes back to habits, right? It goes back to how you behave over a period of time in a regular way. In sort of psychology terms, that would be social conditioning, which is what you're pointing to. It becomes part of who you are. It becomes habit. It becomes instinct. I think sometimes we think we just inherited that. That's nature. But it's also nurture, right? The way we are socially conditioned to accept certain things and to not accept certain things. Some of it is literally visceral instinct, but some of it changes over time. I'll give you the example of food, right? Scotch, right? At first, you look at it and like, ooh, right? This is danger, right? This is wrong. Your gut instinct might be alone, but over time, right, you come to appreciate its finer qualities, right? But also you can see certain kinds of behaviors, some behaviors perhaps on the street or whatever, which might have been acceptable a few years ago, which somehow seem not right now. Perhaps when people are asking questions, who gets recognized and who doesn't, right? The norm changes, it gets conditioned over time. Norms do evolve and change. And I think that's really powerful. If you look at the work of Jonathan Haidt, who's a moral psychologist, he gives you this example. He calls it the rider, the elephant, and the path. Right? The rider is your conscious decision-making apparatus. Like you have an ethical dilemma, figure it out using reason. Right? The elephant, though, is your socially conditioned gut response, right, about what I should do. It's the more immediate. The path is the organization that you're in. In terms of ethics training, what he has found is most ethic training focuses on the rider, the ethical dilemma. Let's talk about it. Let's think about it. But he said, actually, that's not very effective. What's really effective is the focusing on the elephant. It's focusing on the socially conditioned norms. What is socially conditioned to be normative or correct, and that's how most people will respond. And so I just think awareness of this kind of thing among future leaders and current leaders, I think can be a really powerful thing. And I think that is actually what will lead to path changes, to institutional changes, to changing incentives and structures and behaviors and so on. So I'm not saying, I mean, we can teach courses and make a good living on the rider, on ethical dilemmas that we can and should talk about, but I think we have to go deeper in looking at social structures. So, yeah.
So we'll now go to the floor for questions. Please feel free to ask anything from more theoretical questions of how do we intuit that which is right to more specific questions of ethical dimensions of issues of the day or anything we're doing at the Elliott School, anything you want us to talk about. Ladies, you have the floor. Ladies first.
Speak up.
Oh, okay. I'm Molly Seltzer. I graduated from the Elliott School in 2015. I'm a journalist now. I wanted to turn it a little bit more contemporary right now and Washington-based. So obviously we've seen a lot of turnover within the Trump administration along the lines of people who are not able to stay in their roles for a variety of different reasons. And my question would just be around how do you approach ethics and sticking with your post when there is such a flagrant distinction between your values and the values of your superiors?
Chris, do you want to take that? So on the premise, I'll just let the question stand for itself.
Chris, you take it.
Well, for people in government, when you serve in government, you take an oath, of course, to the Constitution and not to the secretary of your cabinet department or to the president. And most people I know in civil service take that oath very, very seriously. There's also a tradition, certainly in the State Department, and an important one, which is you work as hard as you can to help policymakers succeed with their goals. They were elected to carry out an agenda. And you've got a couple choices. The classical ones are exit, voice, or loyalty. And in the policy world, I guess I would view it this way, that what you're entitled to or should be entitled to is to have your views heard and that they're seriously considered. And that's important, and that's what you want to hope for. Now, you're not entitled to have your views endorsed, but that you have been heard fairly. And then if you stay in government, your choice is, am I on board with the program? Do I want to transfer to a different position? Do I want to leave government? And people are making all kinds of those choices. And as an Evan Osnos piece in the New Yorker points out, sometimes, of course, it's not voluntary, where people sense that somehow you're disloyal, and then you are moved to what's colloquially known as the turkey farm. Just you're given some office with some vague assignment, but no real responsibility, and you're just marginalized, sidelined. And that's happening apparently quite a bit. And in my personal view, that's an abuse of government authority. When you come into a government agency, it doesn't matter what your agenda is. You've got trained, qualified people, and you ought to harness that vast talent on behalf of whatever your agenda happens to be. Now, this is slightly off point, but it's a great story, so I've got to tell it. Carl Ford, who was the assistant secretary in INR when I was there, after the Iraq invasion, and all these analysts who had been studying the problem said, oh my God, we're engaged on a terrible, terrible course that's going to just end in utter strategic failure. What he said to the analysts was, look, if the policymaker wants to drive that car off the cliff, Your job is to help him or her get that car to the ground as safely as possible. That's your responsibility.
Gentlemen. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Kay. I graduated from the Elliott School on Friday. Yes, thank you. My question has to do with a sort of common theme on the panel, which was refusing unethical orders and telling authority figures that they're wrong. Well, I admire the fact that the panel upholds these values. I think, at least in my assessment, materially speaking, since the post-USSR era, the United States has had a problem of, I suppose you could say hubris, American hubris, where there is this like larger societal pressure, this almost patriotic pressure to not question the government's foreign policy decisions, namely in Iraq, like someone mentioned on the panel. And obviously this is a flaw in human psychology, as like the Stanford prison experiment showed and the abuse in Abu Ghraib showed. But larger than that even, I think that there's this problem where as soon as the war drive starts, as soon as, these patriotic missile strikes in Syria happen, the American public just kind of blindly rallies behind these interventions. And, for example, with the first Trump strikes in Syria, so many, Democrats and Republicans came behind Trump and said, this is his first presidential act. This is, et cetera, et cetera. Point being, we jump to a lot of military conclusions very quickly, and the tail of the tape does not look very good. The United States killed 1 million people in Iraq. Libya is stateless and anarchic, and the bombing of Raqqa was displaced 150,000 people. Point being, do you think that this American hubris or American patriotism, paternalism almost on the world stage is a problem? And ethically, do we have a responsibility to stop doing these things and to fix what we did abroad?
So Jan, is there a patriotic or ethical duty to question American use of force, and how does one do that?
So I'm going to answer your exact question, but by saying the following: the studies that Dean Brigety referred to, these are from the past. They were from the 20th century, not all of them. Ask the question of how is it that the United States, which is the supreme power, especially after the end of the Cold War, unique in its capacity in every way, but certainly orders of magnitude more powerful militarily, consistently finds itself intervening in countries and regions that it knows absolutely nothing about, even after decades of extensive involvement. So one of the case studies was Iran in the 70s, where we had a huge, both contractor and military presence. And to literally right up until the bitter end, there was an injunction against saying anything about the degree to which the repression of the Shah was contributing to the insurrection and what ultimately led to revolution. Total denial of the role of religion. So there's a systemic issue here, which this used to be so controversial that I couldn't possibly brief it even here, Joel. But that democracies, our democracies, leave it to the US. There is a certain odd pathology about the difficulty of gaining consensus to act and then shedding that consensus in the light of contrary intelligence. So to answer your question, yes, there is absolutely an imperative to question. We have a tendency as Americans to think that military intervention is simpler and more decisive than all the other instruments at our behest. We do not rehearse diplomatic intervention the way that you do a briefing in the Oval Office and you show all the different strike patterns. It looks like you're actually going to do something very. So we are remarkably ignorant about, time after time, we say, wait, I mean, going back to this argument, the arguments I used to have with McNamara, he said, I could not have known that Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist. I mean, we argued until he died about that. And I said, why didn't you go meet somebody that knew him? And, you know, it's like, well, who? And I said, but he said something that this is what inspired all this work, ultimately. He said, there was no one at the table. There was no George Kennan. There was no McGeorge Bundy for that part of the world to advise me. There was no one, quote, certified. And that was the moment of just this huge light bulb went off of like, what does it mean to be certified? I'm in the middle of my certification process in my career. It means that you are not going to rock the boat or knock the table over or question the fundamental consensus that there is a domino effect, and right? So it is technically true that we had weakened the State Department during the McCarthy period, but the Secretary of Defense should have more information about the basic facts of where we are intervening. And you know, I still struggle to explain this because it is not uniquely American, but it's very American.
Ladies, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Veronica Dunlap. I'm Elliott School 2010. I work for a national criminal justice nonprofit, and we do a lot of work with police departments around the country, especially around the area of reconciliation and rebuilding trust and legitimacy. And when I think about the current administration, I personally believe that we've lost, because of the ethical mishaps, we've lost a lot of legitimacy in the foreign space, and we've lost a lot of our power. So I would love to hear your thoughts, especially given my experience with reconciliation in the criminal justice space. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what we should be looking to do when the time arises to sort of regain some legitimacy, because we have had so many ethical missteps as a nation right now.
So Joel, this is something that I hear an awful lot, certainly in my travels, I suspect you do too, that American soft power is taking a real beating in the last 18 months or so. For a variety of reasons. And I'm wondering if you hear that as well, and notwithstanding an electoral or political solution, if the administration were to certify you, the Trump administration were to certify you today and said, you know, Dr. Rosenthal, we understand we're taking a beating. What can we do?
That's great. No, and it actually ties into the previous question. There are two sort of big principles that I think are at stake here, can help inform the conversation. The first one is humility. I mean, I think to be as a fundamental aspect of ethics as we're describing it, because it's often sort of hijacked by moral certainty. And if I could just leave you with one thought for the evening, it'd be anybody who says they're morally certain, you know, I would be worried. Moral certainty often leads to violence, actually. And you know, I can refer you back to Reinhold Niebuhr and some other, you know, prominent American theologian, public philosopher, ethicist types who emphasize the connection between power and humility, and that any act in some way is going to be flawed and in some way self-interested. And so if you know, before you get so morally righteous, you should be sort of thinking in a much more humble way about that. So I just wanted to sort of inject the humility principle in. The other is, if this country stood for anything, I thought that the core principle of it is, I was going to say was, but is pluralism. It is pluralism. We are a pluralistic country, right? And that's based on the ethical principle that my interests are bound up in the interests of your interests, and that we're kind of in that together. And even from a libertarian perspective, even from the sort of the most individualistic perspective you could take, even from an Adam Smith who actually makes this point, which is, yes, I'm a self-interested person, but the first thing a self-interested person has to understand is the interest of the other person, right? If you're going to have any kind of exchange, right? Economists will say. So it's just sort of a basic awareness of this. Now, this country, you know, has been known throughout the world as an exemplar of some imperfect, evolving notion of pluralism, which goes to reconciliation and so on. So, no, I think you're right. And so if I could work on two big items, one would be this humility question, but the other would be getting back to that basic idea of pluralism and what we have in common. And hopefully that we can demonstrate that in some way to the rest of the world. So just some thoughts on that big question.
Hi, thank you. My name's Alec. I'm actually a Columbian College graduate, class of 2015. I work for a decently sized public agency, and we have a new executive director, and one of the priorities that he's set has been to sort of rebuild, because we've had an interesting recent track record, a reputation of ethics and integrity. And one of the things that he says over and over again is that you can have almost everybody in an organization doing the right thing for years, trying to build a reputation for integrity, but one person who messes up or makes the wrong decision in one instance could squander all of those efforts. So as professors of ethics and leadership, you can only reach out to so many students. How do you sort of teach those students to be teachers and influencers to try and scale that influence?
I'm actually going to take a part of that, and because obviously we are all frail, imperfect individuals, and to the extent that institutions try to have a certain set of norms in which they follow, and if there is departure from those norms by an individual, or if multiple individuals in the institution are complicit, the two things that have to happen, one is, to Joel's point, is a sense of acknowledgement and reconciliation, but it is vitally important that the leadership take ownership to re-embrace the norms. In my view, one of the best examples of this in modern times is the Catholic Church, and how fundamentally they failed in their mission to protect children for the purpose of trying, in their view, misguided, clearly at the minimum, of protecting the institution for decades. And as a means of trying to rebuild their trust in their own moral authority, two things started to happen. One was the engagement with survivors, but also was the Pope, Pope Francis in particular. I know Pope Benedict did some, but Pope Francis, I think, deserves the lion's share of the credit for this, saying, "I am sorry," and the Pope, the vicar of Christ on earth, begging for the forgiveness of individual victims. And I suspect that is true for any number of other institutions, that when something has gone wrong, you've gotten wrong, the leadership has to take ownership in order to change it. I wonder if any rest of you have thoughts on this.
I think that was really eloquent. In a much smaller way, I remember briefing some of these cases of strategic failure that had resulted from a failure to take into account concrete intelligence, and we proved, we had all the intelligence lined it off. And I was briefing this. It comes down, when you come down to the prescriptive parts, it's always very difficult. You need to show some tangible examples of when someone speaking up actually changed the moments of policy, but also come up with some prescriptions. So I was talking about a modest suggestion that, for example, in the Foreign Service, that that subordinates should be allowed to write evaluations of their superiors, and one of the elements would be whether or not they listened. And I immediately, one of our very distinguished diplomats, who all of you know, actually said to me, "Oh, Jan, he said, it's just human nature. Some people listen and some people don't." And I said, and yes, and some people start businesses and read and succeed, and some people start businesses and don't do anything and they fail. So surely we can even consider, first of all, it was wonderful to watch the especially established audience when I said the idea that your underling would write a performance review. You could see the faces where it was already too late for them.
That's great.
But even modest steps are very hard to take, right? So you're boss or whoever is doing this it's very interesting. I don't know what agency this is, but
And we don't need to know, for the record. But so I have two boys that are almost 13 and 11. They'll be 13 and 11 this summer. And to the point of building the elephant underneath them, as it were. I've been saying to them, I've been quoting Churchill to them since they were 5 and 3. This quote, that courage is the most important virtue because it's the one that makes all the others possible. And one of the things that's incumbent, this certainly goes to the leadership point as well, is that if you are leading an organization that is either trying to establish or reestablish ethical norms, the people in the organization don't need you to be their buddy. They need you to establish justice and the ground rules for expectations. And those organizations that succeed in these sorts of environments are those that get it wrong. I think another great example of this is Starbucks. There are a quadrillion Starbucks outlets all across the planet. Most are franchised. Only some are owned by the organization. But if 2 African Americans in some outlet somewhere get the police called upon them, Howard Schultz could just as easily have said, that is the fault of that store owner and they are liable. Instead, he owned it for the entire organization and said, we collectively are going to think about how we can make sure this doesn't happen in our stores ever again. That's leadership. It's courageous, ethical leadership. Ladies. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Meredith Fortier. I graduated from the MIPP program back in 2014. My question is, you mentioned the Foreign Service and you mentioned soft power kind of taking a beating at this time. Given the students you see come through Elliott and the Foreign Service applications really being down right now, how do you talk to students about public service? How do you talk to students about why they should be inspired by it? How do you talk to them about managing their expectations, managing what they should look to, when they think about service and how they should think about it during this time period?
It's not merely a theoretical question. Arguably it's a historical one, since we've addressed this at the Elliott School. Chris, do you want to talk about it?
Students raise this question all the time, and I am very clear in my answer to them that public service is a noble undertaking now and always. And look, you're going in, you should seek to go in, and if you go in, you're going to learn so much and make a contribution from the get-go. And, okay, you've got issues with current policies in this administration. Guess what? We have elections and they change. And so I try to be very encouraging about the merit and value and importance of talented young people seeking to serve their country in a wide variety of ways.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, maybe 2. So, gentlemen, sure, Mark.
Mark Arlasco. I'm a graduate of the Graduate School of the Elliott School of International Affairs in '95, and I'm currently at the UN Syria War Crimes Commission of Inquiry, a former member of the intelligence community. We've been speaking about ethics really writ large within the United States, but we're here talking about international affairs. How do we extend that to the international actors that we interface with? And I think on the micro level, for example, when I was with UNAMA in Afghanistan in 2011, dealing with police officers who would shake down the local population. And now on the macro level, dealing with Syria and Russia and the problems that we face with them. How do we extend these ethical teachings that you are trying to extend to your students, and how do we deal with that on an international level?
It's a great question, Jan, Joel. So when you're dealing with an actor whose interests are not only aligned, but whose ethics are unaligned, what do you do?
There's a wonderful dad here, I hope I'm not singling you out, who asked this question during the cocktail hour about, is it actually possible that the liberal international order that the United States has done so much to encourage with all of its norms could actually be taken down in 18 months? I'm not changing the subject, but it sort of goes to this question of whether, our retrenchment from a moral standing is going to is it possible to actually undo? So I didn't answer the question, did I? So let's turn it to Joel.
Well, I mean, I think it is related, Jan, to, that's right. I mean, what this country, it is tied into it. What we tried to build after World War II was a set of institutions that were based on a set of norms that would at least be functional in certain ways to promote some kind of stable, predictable world order that had some norms underneath it. Again, imperfect, but it means aligning the power of this country, the power of our allies around certain core interests that have values embedded in them. I think one of the great mistakes, it was amazing how it was exhibited, and I felt almost bad for former Secretary of State Tillerson when he came out of the box, when he was, he talked about we have to separate our values from our interests. If you should look this up. I mean, it was extraordinary. And he just missed the basic point that interests and values do come together at some point. They do align. Anyway, it's a sort of a big picture answer to your question, but as we think about our interests and we think about building norms and institutions around those norms, it's going to be very imperfect around themes like corruption and so on. We're not going to be able to change behaviors, but I think we can create norms, expected and required behavior around certain issues that will help to promote a more stable and peaceful world. That would be my big approach. It's harder as you get into specific issues.
Ladies, final question.
Okay, yes, so my name is Usha Pitts. I'm Elliott School class of 96, which I wouldn't have advertised, but somebody put it on my badge in a very cruel move. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. I've been a Foreign Service officer for 20 years, and I credit the Elliott School for positioning me to pass that darn test. And since none of the young women here raised their hands to ask a question, I just thought I would jump in and say that I'm currently a recruiter for the State Department for the Foreign Service. So I've wrestled with exactly the question you brought up, and anybody who would like to talk to me about the June Foreign Service Officer Test should come and talk to me now. I've just got a month left, and I would love to get some other Elliott School grads in the program.
Okay. Well, on that hopeful note, let me again thank all of you for coming. Let me thank in particular our hosts, Joel Rosenthal and his team here at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. Let me say a special thank you to Elaine Garby, who's did so much, and also to Shanae and all of our other sort of colleagues who've done so much. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dean Brigety. Again, thank you, Dr. Rosenthal and Melissa Semeniak for hosting us here at the Carnegie Council. We really, really appreciate it. This is a great setup for us. And thank you, Jan and Chris and Reuben. This was a very engaging and lively discussion, and I'm sure that everybody here really enjoyed it. So I really hope that we can repeat it at some point. Again, my name is Elaine Garby. I'm the Senior Associate Director for Elliott School Alumni Programs. I'm just going to take 2 more minutes of your time to talk a little bit more about our alumni activities here in New York. We, of course, have so many alumni here, but also several Elliott School parents and a couple of admitted graduate students. So it's truly an Elliott School and GW community here in New York. For the alumni, we are all members of an amazing worldwide network now numbering over 24,000 Elliott School alumni with graduation this past weekend. And not to mention there's over 290,000 GW alumni worldwide. Those alumni are an invaluable resource, whether you're looking for a job, moving to a new city, or just want to stay connected to GW. And that's where alumni programming is here to help. There are many ways for you to remain engaged with the Elliott School and GW through receptions like these, social and networking in career events, and volunteer opportunities with graduate recruitment and career development, to name a few. Your connection to the Elliott School and GW doesn't end with graduation, and we hope you'll remain engaged with us long after you left campus. If you'd like to learn more about staying connected with the Elliott School and GW, alumni and students, please see me afterwards. We're looking to plan more casual Elliott gatherings in New York beyond this annual discussion and reception. And of course, we can always use more volunteers to help plan and staff those. I also want to highlight our alumni industry networks for GW-wide, such as politics and government, finance, and media and communications, which are great opportunities to network across GW schools and within your industries. In fact, the finance and media and communications groups both have events coming up in New York in June. And there are cards at the registration table on the way out that you can get more information to sign up and get those invitations. Finally, I want to thank our donors who are indicated by these blue ribbons on your name tags. Your support plays a critical role in advancing and continuing our programs. I particularly want to highlight the Elliott School Dean's Fund, which is now exclusively dedicated to enhancing the student experience, both in the classroom and beyond campus. The fund boosts curriculum development, such as teaching real-world skills, and expands the number of opportunities students have for on-the-ground learning through study abroad, internships, field research, and engagement with the policy community. I hope you'll join me in supporting these crucial opportunities. And I do want to just highlight the Carnegie Council has a new leaders program for people between 25 and 45. So if you want to learn more, there's cards out there. They do have a social coming up at the end of June, and guests are welcome. So you don't have to be a member at that time when you join. So thanks again for joining us tonight. We still have some time to mingle and network. The drinks and food have been brought down from upstairs, and I hope you have a good evening. Thanks so much.